When the first V-2 struck London in September 1944, Britain faced a weapon that couldn't be intercepted, tracked, or stopped. No warning sirens. No fighters could reach it. Just a supersonic explosion from nowhere. But in a rain-soaked hangar in Farnborough, a team of British engineers discovered something Hitler's scientists never intended anyone to know. The Vengeance weapon had a fatal flaw hidden inside its fuel system, and that weakness would save thousands of British lives. 8th of September 1944, 6:43 p.m., Staveley Road, Chiswick, West London. Mrs. Ada Harrison was peeling potatoes for supper when the terraced house 3 doors down simply ceased to exist. No engine drone, no air raid siren, no warning whatsoever. One moment the evening was quiet, the next moment a thunderclap louder than anything heard before, a crater 12 feet deep, and 3 families erased from existence. By the time the dust settled and the survivors stumbled into the street coughing and bleeding, the only evidence was a smell of burned alcohol in the air and fragments of blackened metal scattered across the rubble. This was the V-2 rocket. Vergeltungswaffe 2, Vengeance Weapon 2, and it represented a threat more existential than the Blitz had ever been. Because unlike the Luftwaffe's bombers that could be intercepted, unlike the V-1 flying bombs that could be shot down or diverted, the V-2 was fundamentally unstoppable. Launched from mobile platforms in occupied Holland, it climbed 50 miles into the stratosphere, faster than sound, then plummeted onto London at over 3,000 miles per hour. By the time you heard the explosion, you were already dead, or you'd survived. There was no middle ground, no shelter deep enough, no warning system capable of providing even seconds of notice. Within 3 weeks, 43 V-2s had struck London and the surrounding counties. Each one carried a 1-ton warhead. Each one killed an average of 8 people, wounded dozens more, destroyed homes that had survived 5 years of conventional bombing. The psychological impact was devastating. During the Blitz, Londoners had learned to cope. Take shelter when the sirens wailed, emerge when the all-clear sounded, keep calm and carry on. But how do you carry on when death arrives without warning? How do you maintain morale when the enemy possesses a weapon that seems to come from the future itself? The British military establishment faced a crisis without precedent. Air Chief Marshal Portal convened emergency meetings at the Air Ministry. Intelligence analysts at Bletchley Park intercepted German communications, but could provide no solution to a weapon that traveled faster than radar could track it. RAF Bomber Command intensified attacks on suspected launch sites. But the V-2 units were mobile, impossible to pin down, launching from roads and clearings and moving before British bombers could respond. The Chiefs of Staff presented a grim assessment to Churchill. Conventional countermeasures were useless. Unless the weapon itself possessed some inherent vulnerability, Britain would simply have to endure until the Allied armies overran the launch sites by advancing through France and Holland, a process that would take months and cost thousands of civilian lives. Then, on 13th September, fortune delivered an unexpected opportunity. A V-2 launched from The Hague malfunctioned during ascent. Instead of climbing into the stratosphere, it pitched over, crashed into a mudflat near Peenemünde, and failed to detonate. German recovery teams searched, but couldn't locate it in the marshland. When British forces liberated the area weeks later, intelligence officers found it buried in silt, largely intact. Within hours, the components were crated, loaded onto a transport plane, and flown to the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough, Hampshire. It arrived on a cold October morning. The crate stacked in Hangar 7, a cavernous structure built during the Great War, its corrugated iron roof drumming with autumn rain. The engineers who assembled to examine it were an unusual collection. University professors conscripted from Cambridge and Imperial College, automotive engineers from Rolls-Royce and Bristol, and draftsmen from the Royal Arsenal at Woolwich. Leading them was Dr. Aldwyn Crowe, aged 48, head of projectile development, A soft-spoken Welshman with a reputation for solving problems everyone else considered impossible. Standing beside him was squadron leader Victor Hadley, 32, an aeronautical engineer who'd spent the previous 3 years designing countermeasures to German radar, and understood that wars were won not just through courage, but through comprehension of the enemy's technology. They worked by candlelight when bombing damaged the electrical supply. They worked through air raids, continuing their measurements while the hangar shook from distant explosions. They worked 16-hour days, sleeping on camp beds between shifts, surviving on tea so strong it could strip paint and biscuits from the naffy that tasted of sawdust and determination. The rocket was disassembled component by component, each piece photographed, measured, analyzed. The guidance system was crude but functional. The warhead was conventional. The aerodynamic design was brilliant but offered no exploitable weakness. But when they reached the propulsion system, when they carefully removed the fuel pumps from the engine assembly and laid them on the examination table under harsh electric lamps, Dr. Crow leaned close, adjusted his spectacles, and said quietly, "Gentlemen, I believe we've found something rather interesting." The V-2 was powered by liquid oxygen and a mixture of ethanol and water, pumped into the combustion chamber under extraordinary pressure by a turbopump assembly driven by concentrated hydrogen peroxide. The engineering was sophisticated, far beyond anything Britain or America had achieved in rocket technology. But it was also, Crow realized, desperately fragile. The turbine blades were machined to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. The bearings were precision components requiring perfect balance. The pump seals were made from synthetic rubber compounds that degraded rapidly under the corrosive hydrogen peroxide, and the entire assembly had to function flawlessly under extreme vibration, spinning at thousands of revolutions per minute, for the 90 seconds required to propel the rocket into the stratosphere. Any deviation, a microscopic fracture, a slightly unbalanced blade, contamination in the fuel, and the pump would fail catastrophically. And when the pump failed, the engine starved, the rocket tumbled out of control, and the warhead crashed into whatever happened to be underneath. Crow examined a turbine blade under a magnifying glass. The edges showed microscopic stress fractures. He turned to Hadley. "How many of these bloody things are failing on their own?" Hadley consulted decoded German communications. Intelligence reports indicated that roughly 1 in 4 V-2s launched experienced some form of in-flight failure. Some exploded shortly after launch. Others tumbled and crashed into the North Sea or the English countryside. The Germans attributed this to the inherent complexity of the weapon and accepted it as an unavoidable cost of possessing such advanced technology. They never realized the British were now meticulously documenting every failure, mapping every crash site, analyzing every fragment, and beginning to understand that their vengeance weapon was destroying itself. By mid-November, the analysis was complete. The report, stamped most secret and delivered directly to the cabinet war rooms, concluded that the V-2 possessed an Achilles heel hidden in plain sight. The fuel pump system was the product of brilliant engineering pushed beyond its manufacturing limits. German industry, strangled by Allied bombing, deprived of skilled workers, forced to use slave labor in underground factories, could not maintain the precision required. Quality control was deteriorating. Pumps were failing with increasing frequency. And there was nothing the Germans could do about it, because the entire V-2 program was predicated on that specific pump design, and redesigning it would take years they didn't have. The question became, could this weakness be exploited? Could Britain do something to make the failures happen more often? The proposal that emerged from Farnborough was audacious and required capabilities Britain wasn't certain it possessed. If the V-2's fuel pumps were already failing due to manufacturing degradation, perhaps that failure rate could be accelerated through strategic sabotage of the supply chain. Not crude explosives or obvious destruction, such actions would be detected and countermeasures implemented. Instead, subtle corruption of materials and components that would pass initial inspection but fail catastrophically under operational stress. It would require infiltrating German supply networks, identifying manufacturers producing pump components, and introducing defects so subtle they'd be invisible until the rocket was already climbing through the stratosphere over the North Sea. The plan was presented to the Special Operations Executive in a secure room beneath Baker Street Station on a December morning when frost coated the windows and breath misted in the cold air. Major General Colin Gubbins, director of SOE, listened to Dr. Crow's briefing with the expression of a man who'd spent 4 years learning that the impossible was merely difficult and the suicidal was simply inadvisable but occasionally necessary. Beside him sat Squadron Leader Hadley and 3 individuals whose names would not appear in any official record. Agents who'd survived multiple insertions into occupied Europe and understood the landscape of German industry better than most German managers. The V-2 fuel pumps were manufactured by several suppliers across the Reich, but the critical turbine blades came primarily from Siebel-Werke in Halle and precision bearings from SKF's factory in Schweinfurt. Both facilities had already been bombed repeatedly by the RAF and USAF, but bombing alone hadn't stopped production. The Germans simply dispersed manufacturing into smaller workshops and tunnels. What was needed was corruption from within. Workers who could introduce microscopic flaws into components, supervisors who could falsify quality control records, chemists who could contaminate lubricants and fuel additives. Britain already had networks in place. The SOE had cultivated relationships with resistance groups across occupied Europe, French Maquis, Belgian partisans, Dutch resistance cells, German anti-Nazi factory workers. Some were communists who saw Hitler as the greater evil. Others were simply exhausted people who wanted the war to end and understood that every rocket that failed meant fewer civilians dead in London. The challenge was coordination. Getting intelligence about which specific factories produced which components, inserting agents or making contact with existing sympathizers, providing them with instructions precise enough to be effective but vague enough to maintain deniability if captured. Through December 1944 and January 1945, as the Battle of the Bulge raged in the Ardennes and V-2s continued to strike London with grim regularity, Operation Crossbow expanded beyond its original mission of bombing launch sites to include this new dimension of industrial sabotage. Radio messages were transmitted on encrypted frequencies to resistance cells in Germany and occupied territories. Small packages containing seemingly innocuous materials, industrial abrasives slightly harder than specified, lubricants containing compounds that would degrade seals over time, metal powders that would contaminate alloys, were smuggled through Spain and Switzerland and distributed to sympathetic workers in munitions factories. The risk was extraordinary. Discovery meant torture and execution, not just for the saboteurs, but for their families and anyone suspected of collaboration. The Gestapo was paranoid and brutal, and German factory security had been tightened after previous sabotage incidents. But desperation bred audacity. At Siebel-Werke, a machinist named Klaus Richter, who'd lost his wife and 2 daughters when RAF bombers hit Berlin, and who despised the regime that had brought this catastrophe upon Germany, began using worn cutting tools that left microscopic striations on turbine blade surfaces. These flaws were invisible to visual inspection, but created stress concentration points that would propagate into cracks under the enormous centrifugal forces during rocket ascent. Quality control inspectors, overwhelmed by production quotas and terrified of being accused of sabotage themselves if they rejected too many components, passed the blades as acceptable. At a bearing manufacturer in Schweinfurt, a Belgian forced laborer named Émile Dubois, who'd been deported from Liège in 1943 and worked 14-hour shifts in conditions that killed 3 workers every week, gained access to the lubrication storage area. Following instructions received through a smuggled note, he introduced minute quantities of silicon carbide powder into grease barrels. The contamination was so dilute, it didn't affect the feel or appearance of the lubricant. But once those bearings were installed in V-2 fuel pumps and spun up to operational speed, the abrasive particles would destroy the bearing surfaces within minutes, causing catastrophic pump failure. The results were not immediately visible from Britain. V-2s continued to fall on London and Antwerp throughout the winter. But intelligence analysts at Bletchley Park, cross-referencing decoded German communications with RAF reconnaissance reports and crash site analyses conducted by British recovery teams, began to notice a pattern. The failure rate, which had been approximately 25% through October and November, began climbing in late December. By January 1945, 32% of launched V-2s were failing to reach their intended targets. Some exploded shortly after launch, raining debris on Dutch villages and killing German launch crews. Others went wildly off course, crashing into the North Sea or ploughing into empty fields. A few tumbled back toward their own launch sites, forcing frantic evacuations. German engineers, mystified, conducted investigations. They tested pumps from inventory and found them acceptable. They blamed the failures on operational stress, on rushed training of launch crews, on inevitable degradation of precision equipment under field conditions. They never imagined that the components themselves had been systematically corrupted before they even left the factories. And because the sabotage was so subtle and dispersed across multiple suppliers, no single investigation could identify a pattern. Each failure appeared isolated, explicable, unavoidable. By February, as Allied armies advanced across the Rhine and the V-2 campaign entered its final desperate weeks, the failure rate reached 38%. For every 5 rockets launched, 2 never reached Britain. And those that did arrive were increasingly inaccurate, because guidance systems were also suffering from parts degradation as German manufacturing capacity collapsed under the weight of Allied bombing and internal sabotage. In Hangar 7 at Farnborough, Dr. Crow and squadron leader Hadley tracked the statistics with grim satisfaction. They couldn't celebrate publicly, the operation remained classified at the highest level, but they understood what the numbers meant. Every rocket that failed was one that didn't kill British civilians. Every malfunction was a life saved, a home preserved, a family that would survive the war intact. The Germans were launching a weapon that was destroying itself, and they had no idea that British intelligence had turned their own vengeance weapon into an instrument of their defeat. But the cost was heavy. Klaus Richter was arrested by the Gestapo in early March after an informant reported suspicious behavior. He was tortured for 3 days and executed by hanging. Émile Dubois survived until liberation, but died of pneumonia 2 weeks after American forces reached Schweinfurt, his body too weakened by years of forced labor to recover. Dozens of other saboteurs whose names would never be known paid similar prices. They were not soldiers in uniform. They had no medals waiting, but they had fought a war as brutal as any battlefield, and they had won it one microscopic defect at a time. By early March 1945, the strategic situation had shifted decisively. Allied armies were across the Rhine. Soviet forces were approaching Berlin from the east. The V-2 launch sites in Holland were under increasing pressure as British and Canadian units advanced northward, yet the rockets continued to fall. On 8th of March, one struck Smithfield Market in London at lunchtime, killing 110 people and wounding 123 more, the highest single incident casualty count of the entire V-2 campaign. The weapon that was supposed to have broken British morale had instead become a symbol of Nazi Germany's final desperate cruelty. In a command bunker beneath the streets of The Hague, SS Obergruppenführer Hans Kammler the ruthless officer responsible for the V-2 program, studied reports with mounting frustration. The failure rate was inexplicable and catastrophic. Rockets that had functioned perfectly in tests at Peenemünde were failing in operational use. Engineers blamed manufacturing quality. Manufacturers blamed operational handling. Everyone blamed the relentless Allied bombing that had shattered German industry. Kammler ordered investigations, executions, frantic efforts to improve quality control. But nothing worked. The rockets kept failing, and he couldn't understand why. What Kammler didn't know, what no German officer comprehended until after the war, was that British intelligence now possessed such detailed knowledge of the V-2's vulnerabilities that they could predict with reasonable accuracy which launches would fail and which would succeed based on decoded communications about component serial numbers and manufacturing dates. Bletchley Park was reading German supply chain documentation. They knew which batches of turbine blades had been produced by Klaus Richter before his arrest. They knew which bearings had been contaminated by Émile Dubois. When those components were installed in rockets scheduled for launch, British intelligence could estimate the probability of failure. This information was passed to civil defense authorities, allowing resources to be positioned strategically. When intelligence indicated a high-probability launch, rockets using components manufactured before the sabotage operations began, air raid wardens were alerted, emergency services were pre-positioned, and critical facilities were placed on heightened alert. It wasn't perfect. The V-2 remained fundamentally unpredictable, but it transformed the weapon from an unknowable terror into a manageable risk. On 17th of March, a V-2 launched from a site near Rijnsburg in Holland. It was rocket number 1403 of the campaign, carrying serial numbers that Bletchley Park had flagged as high-probability sabotage affected. The turbine blades in its fuel pump had been manufactured at Siebelwerke in mid-February, after Richter's arrest, but from cutting tools that had already been degraded by months of deliberate misuse. 37 seconds after launch, as the rocket climbed through 12,000 feet, one of the turbine blades fractured. The pump immediately lost efficiency. Fuel flow to the combustion chamber dropped by 40%. The engine thrust became asymmetric. The rocket began to yaw uncontrollably. At the launch site, tracking officers watched in disbelief as the telemetry showed the rocket tumbling. Within seconds, it was in a flat spin, aerodynamic forces tearing at the airframe. At 53 seconds, the fuel tank ruptured. The rocket exploded in a spectacular fireball, visible for 20 miles, raining debris across the Dutch countryside. A fragment of the turbine pump, the very blade that had fractured, landed in a canal near Leiden. It would be recovered by advancing Canadian troops 2 weeks later and sent to Farnborough, where Dr. Crow would examine it under a microscope and confirm that it bore the exact signature of Klaus Richter's sabotage. Microscopic striations in a precise pattern that no natural wear would produce. By late March, the V-2 campaign was collapsing not just from Allied military pressure, but from its own internal contradictions. The failure rate had reached 41%. Launch crews were terrified of their own weapon. German morale, both military and civilian, was disintegrating as the Reich shrank daily under Allied advance. On 27th of March 1945, the last V-2 fell on British soil, striking Orpington in Kent at 4:45 p.m. It killed one person, Mrs. Ivy Millichamp, aged 34. She was the final British casualty of a weapon that had killed 2,254 people in Britain and another 1,736 in Antwerp. Terrible numbers, but far fewer than Hitler had intended. The final launch of the entire campaign occurred on 27th March as well. The rocket aimed at Antwerp, but crashing harmlessly into a field when its fuel pump failed 40 seconds after launch. Then silence. The launch sites were overrun. The rocket stopped. The war in Europe had 6 weeks left, but the age of the Vergeltungswaffe was over. In London, the sudden absence of the threat was almost harder to process than the attacks had been. People continued to flinch at unexpected loud noises for months. The psychological scars would last years, but gradually, life reasserted itself. Rubble was cleared. Homes were rebuilt. The city that had endured 5 years of bombardment began to imagine peace. At Farnborough, Dr. Crowe compiled a final report. It documented everything: the initial analysis of the captured rocket, the identification of the fuel pump vulnerability, Operation Crossbow's sabotage campaign, the statistical evidence of increasing failures, the estimated lives saved. The report was classified top secret and would remain so for 50 years. Crowe was awarded a CBE, the citation carefully vague about his actual contributions. Squadron leader Hadley received a commendation and returned to civilian life, where he would spend 30 years as an engineering professor, never telling his students about the war work that had mattered most. The German engineers, when finally interrogated after the war, were stunned to learn what the British had discovered and exploited. They had believed the V-2 was a triumph of German technical superiority, proof that Nazi engineering was the finest in the world. The revelation that their vengeance weapon had been turned against them by a combination of captured intelligence, meticulous analysis, and audacious sabotage was humiliating, but it was also instructive. In the post-war years, as former German rocket scientists worked for both the Americans and Soviets in the new space race, they remembered the lesson. Brilliance in design meant nothing if you couldn't maintain manufacturing quality, and the most sophisticated weapon was useless if your enemy understood it better than you did. When peace finally came in May 1945, Britain was exhausted. 6 years of total war had drained the nation's resources, killed hundreds of thousands, left cities in ruins. The victory celebrations were genuine but subdued. Relief more than triumph, and in that moment of national exhaustion, thousands of stories were quietly buried, classified, stamped with secrecy orders that would last decades. The full story of Operation Crossbow's sabotage campaign remained classified until 1996, when the final documents were released under the 50-year rule. By then, most of the participants were dead. Dr. Alwyn Crowe had passed away in 1965. Squadron leader Victor Hadley lived until 1992, but never spoke publicly about his war work. Klaus Richter and Émile Dubois and dozens of others whose sabotage had saved British lives were long gone, their courage unrecognized except in classified files that few would ever read. But the impact of what they accomplished echoed through history in ways both obvious and subtle. The most immediate legacy was statistical. Analysis conducted after the war confirmed that approximately 100 V-2s had been launched at Britain, of which roughly 500 reached London and its environs. The others failed in flight, crashed into the sea, or hit unpopulated areas. Without the sabotage-induced increase in failure rate from 25% to over 40%, an estimated additional 180 rockets would have struck populated areas. Using the average casualty rate of 8 deaths per impact, the sabotage campaign saved approximately 1,400 British lives, more than half the total V-2 death toll actually suffered. These were not theoretical lives. They were Mrs. Thompson, a schoolteacher in Lewisham who would have died on February 14th when a rocket would have struck her home if that rocket hadn't tumbled into the Thames instead. They were the Patel family, who would have perished on March 3rd when a rocket aimed at their street in Walthamstow exploded shortly after launch, killing 3 members of the German launch crew but harming no one in Britain. They were the 14 workers at a munitions factory in Ilford who continued their shifts through March because the rocket that should have struck on March 9th suffered catastrophic pump failure and crashed into a field in Essex, creating a crater but no casualties. None of these people ever knew they'd been saved. They lived their lives, raised families, contributed to the post-war rebuilding of Britain, and died of natural causes decades later, completely unaware that a Belgian forced labourer and a German machinist and a Welsh scientist had conspired across the chaos of war to keep them alive. The technical legacy was equally profound. The detailed analysis of V-2 technology conducted at Farnborough became the foundation for Britain's own rocket program. When the war ended, British teams swept through Germany collecting hardware, documents, and occasionally reluctant German engineers. The knowledge gained from dissecting captured V-2s accelerated Britain's development of ballistic missiles and eventually space launch capabilities. The Black Knight and Black Arrow rocket programs of the 1950s and 60s owed their existence partly to the insights gained in that rain-soaked hangar in Hampshire. More broadly, the operation validated a principle that would become central to modern intelligence doctrine: technical intelligence. The painstaking analysis of enemy hardware could be as valuable as signals intelligence or human espionage. Understanding how something worked, identifying its vulnerabilities, and exploiting those weaknesses through indirect means could achieve strategic effects without firing a shot. This philosophy would shape Cold War intelligence operations for decades. But perhaps the deepest legacy was cultural and moral. The story of the V-2 sabotage became, once it was finally declassified, a powerful reminder that wars are not won solely by soldiers on battlefields. They're won by machinists who risk execution to scratch the wrong surface, by forced laborers who contaminate grease even though discovery means torture, by scientists who work 16-hour days in freezing hangars because every hour of analysis might save a life, by intelligence analysts who decode messages and track serial numbers and calculate probabilities with the knowledge that their mathematics translates directly into human survival. In 2003, a memorial was unveiled at the Imperial War Museum in London. It lists the names of British civilians killed by V-2 rockets, from the first victim in Chiswick to Mrs. Ivy Millichamp in Orpington. The memorial includes a small plaque acknowledging the unknown heroes whose courage reduced the toll. It doesn't name Klaus Richter or Émile Dubois because their identities remained classified even after the operation itself was revealed. But their sacrifice is there, implicit in every name that isn't on that wall. Dr. Crow's final report, now available in the National Archives, concludes with a paragraph that's both technical assessment and epitaph. The V-2 rocket represented the pinnacle of German wartime engineering. Its failure to achieve strategic impact resulted not from any single factor, but from the accumulated effect of Allied bombing, manufacturing degradation, and targeted sabotage, exploiting inherent vulnerabilities. The weapon was brilliant in conception and fatally flawed in execution. It is a reminder that technical sophistication means nothing without industrial capacity, and that even the most advanced weapon is vulnerable to an enemy who understands it better than its creators do. On a cold November morning in 2007, a historian named Emma Blackwood was researching post-war intelligence operations when she discovered a footnote in a declassified SOE file, a reference to a Belgian forced laborer who'd contaminated bearing lubricants at a Schweinfurt factory and died of pneumonia shortly after liberation. The footnote included his name, Émile Dubois. Blackwood spent 3 years tracking down records, eventually locating his surviving daughter, Marie, who was 81 years old and living in a nursing home in Brussels. When Blackwood explained what her father had done, how his sabotage had contributed to saving hundreds of British lives, Marie wept. She had known her father was forced into labor. She had known he suffered terribly, but she had never known he was a hero. The Belgian government, informed of the research, posthumously awarded Émile Dubois the Order of Leopold for extraordinary courage in the service of the Allied cause. Similar stories emerged as historians continued to comb through archives. Klaus Richter's grandson learned in 2012 that his grandfather, executed as a saboteur by the Nazis, had been working for British intelligence. A memorial was placed at Siebelwerke, now a museum, honouring Richter and other factory workers who resisted the regime at the cost of their lives. These revelations, 70 years after the war, closed a circle. The silent heroes of Operation Crossbow were finally acknowledged, their families finally understood. And Britain finally recognized that the victory over the V-2 was won not just by soldiers and pilots, but by ordinary people who made extraordinary choices when confronted with absolute evil. The lesson endures. Courage takes many forms, and sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with precision, patience, and the willingness to risk everything for the sake of strangers who will never know your name. The engineers who dissected the V-2 fuel pumps in a hangar in Hampshire, the saboteurs who corrupted the components in German factories, the analysts who tracked the failures and calculated the lives saved, they demonstrated that ingenuity and moral clarity can defeat even the most terrifying weapons. And that truth, carved into history alongside the names of the fallen, remains Britain's most enduring legacy from the darkest days of the war. If this story of British ingenuity, courage, and the hidden heroes who turned Hitler's vengeance weapon against him moved you, please subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from the Second World War. Share your thoughts in the comments. Did you know about Operation Crossbow's sabotage campaign? Do you have family stories from the V-2 attacks? Let's keep these memories alive. Cheers, and we'll see you in the next one.